He told me I'd find my father here. The words hung in the frozen morning air like a confession whispered to the dead. Elizabeth Scott's breath caught. She had come to visit her late husband's grave alone, as she always did, seeking the only place where grief still felt honest. But she wasn't alone. Huddled against James's headstone sat a boy, no older than 10, his thin jacket pulled tight against the November wind. His small shoulders trembled, not just from cold, and his eyes were fixed on the carved name before him as though waiting for an answer. Elizabeth's heels crunched against frost-hardened grass as she stepped closer, clutching her bouquet of lilies and roses. "Child," she said gently, her voice soft but firm. "Are you all right?" The boy turned. His face was gaunt, his dark skin ashen from cold and hunger, but his eyes held something Elizabeth hadn't expected, recognition. Not of her, but of the name on the stone. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to bother you. I came to see Mr. James." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "Mr. James?" The boy nodded, pulling his knees tighter to his chest. "My mom said if I ever got lost, I should come here. She said he promised he'd help me." Her throat tightened. James had been gone for 2 years. They'd had no children. No godchildren. No secret wards. She had buried every dream of family with him. Yet here sat a boy calling her husband by name, speaking of promises she'd never heard. "What's your name?" she asked, crouching despite the cold biting through her designer coat. "Davis Jackson, ma'am." "And how old are you, Davis?" 10. Elizabeth's gaze traveled over him, her businesswoman's instinct cataloging every detail: torn sneakers held together with duct tape, jeans stained and too short, a coat so threadbare it might as well have been paper. His hands were raw, his nails dirty. This child hadn't just been neglected. He'd been surviving. "Are you here alone?" Davis hesitated, then nodded. "My mom's gone. She got real sick last year and, she didn't make it. But before she left, she told me if I ever needed help, should find Mr. James Scott. She said he'd keep his promise." The world tilted. Elizabeth stared at the headstone, at her husband's name carved into stone, and felt something crack inside her chest. James Scott. Beloved husband. Visionary. Leader. But never a father. Never someone who made secret promises to dying women. "How did your mother know my husband?" Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. Davis reached into his worn backpack and pulled out a faded photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. He held it out with trembling fingers. Elizabeth took it. Her heart stopped. The image showed a younger James, maybe 15 years ago, standing outside a hospital with a woman holding an infant. The woman was smiling through tears. James's hand rested gently on her shoulder, his expression tender in a way Elizabeth hadn't seen in years. "That's my mom," Davis said. "Maria Jackson. She said Mr. James saved her life once. And that when she was gone, he'd save mine too." Elizabeth couldn't breathe. The photograph trembled in her hands. She looked at the boy, at his dark, piercing eyes, the same shape as James's. The same quiet intensity. "Where have you been staying, Davis?" "The shelter on 4th Street. But it's full now." He paused, his voice dropping. "Sometimes the bus depot. It's warm at night if you sit near the vents." The words cut through her like glass. A 10-year-old boy. Sleeping at a bus depot. Because her husband had made a promise she'd never known about. Elizabeth stood slowly, her mind racing. She could walk away. Call social services. Let the system handle this boy the way it handled thousands of others. But as she looked at the grave, at James's name, she heard his voice in her memory: "Kindness isn't a transaction, Liz. It's a legacy." She reached out her hand. "You can't stay at a bus stop, Davis. Come with me. I'll take you somewhere warm. Davis stared at her hand as though it might disappear. But you don't know me. I knew someone who cared about you, Elizabeth said quietly. And if he made a promise, I'm going to make sure it's kept. After a long moment, Davis placed his small, cold hand in hers. Together, they walked through the cemetery gates. Elizabeth glanced back once at her husband's grave, the lilies still clutched in her other hand. The stone seemed to watch them leave, silent and knowing. She whispered, almost too soft to hear, "James, what did you do?" When this homeless boy spoke of a promise her late husband made, something inside billionaire Elizabeth Scott broke open and rebuilt at the same time. Because sometimes, the people we think we've lost are still keeping promises we never knew they made. If this moment moved you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like, share your thought and subscribe for more stories where kindness outlives us all. They drove in silence through the city, Davis sitting stiffly in the passenger seat of Elizabeth's Mercedes, watching the buildings blur past with wide, uncertain eyes. She could feel his tension, the way he held himself as though ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "A little," he admitted. "I had some crackers yesterday." Yesterday. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. She pulled into a quiet cafe near her estate, the kind of place where she'd once met James for lunch between board meetings. The owner, Margaret, raised an eyebrow when Elizabeth entered with a homeless boy in tow, but she smiled warmly. "2 grilled cheese sandwiches," Elizabeth said. "And hot chocolate. Extra marshmallows." Davis sat carefully at the table, his hands folded as though afraid to touch anything. "Thank you, ma'am." The words sounded rehearsed, like a script his mother had taught him. Always be polite. Always say thank you. Even when the world forgets to be kind. Elizabeth's chest ached. "You don't have to call me ma'am, Davis. Elizabeth is fine." When the food arrived, he ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as though it might be his last. Elizabeth watched him and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years, purpose. After they finished, she drove him to her estate. Davis stared through the gates at the sprawling manor, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You live here?" "I do." "All by yourself?" Elizabeth paused. "Yes. All by myself." Inside, she led him to one of the guest rooms. It was larger than most apartments, with a king-sized bed, an ensuite bathroom, and a view of the gardens. Davis stood frozen in the doorway. "You can wash up and rest," Elizabeth said gently. "There are clean towels in the bathroom. I'll bring you some clothes that might fit." "Are you sure it's okay?" Davis asked, his voice small. "It's more than okay. You're safe here." That night, after Davis had fallen asleep in the guest room, Elizabeth sat alone in James's old study. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne. She opened drawer after drawer, searching for something, anything that might explain the photograph, the promise, the boy sleeping upstairs. And then she found it. Hidden behind a row of law books was a manila envelope, sealed and addressed in James's handwriting, "To the boy I owe my redemption." Elizabeth's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 3 months before James's death, and another photograph, James with Maria Jackson, holding a newborn Davis in a hospital room. The letter began, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Davis has found you, then Maria is too. Liz, there are things I never told you." Elizabeth's vision blurred with tears as she read the truth her husband had carried alone. Maria Jackson wasn't a scandal or a secret affair. She was the woman who had saved James's life when he'd been on the brink of ending it all, years before he'd met Elizabeth. A hospital janitor who'd found him in his car outside a shelter, talked him down from the edge, and given him a reason to believe in tomorrow. James had promised her that if anything ever happened to her son, he would make sure the boy was cared for. That promise had been sacred to him. Secret, but sacred. And now it was Elizabeth's. She looked at the photograph of Davis and his mother, at the hope in Maria's eyes, and understood. James hadn't left her alone. He'd left her a purpose. A reason to stop drowning in grief and start living again. The next morning, Elizabeth made a decision. She would find out everything about Davis's past, uncover the full story of James's connection to Maria Jackson, and honor the promise her husband had made. But first, she needed to know the truth about the Scott Foundation and why Davis's mother's name appeared nowhere in their charity records. Because Elizabeth Scott hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by accepting mysteries at face value. And if someone had tried to erase Maria Jackson's memory, they were about to learn that a widow's wrath was far more dangerous than a billionaire's ambition. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Elizabeth's estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Davis sat at the breakfast table, his small frame almost swallowed by the high-backed chair, staring at a plate of scrambled eggs and toast as though it were a museum exhibit. "Go ahead," Elizabeth said gently, pouring him orange juice. "Eat." He picked up his fork with careful precision, cutting his eggs into small, deliberate pieces. "Thank you, Mrs. Scott." The formality stung. She was used to corporate boardrooms where people addressed her with manufactured respect, but this felt different. This child's politeness came from survival, not strategy. "You have very good manners," Elizabeth observed. Davis kept his eyes on his plate. "Mom taught me. She said manners cost nothing but mean everything." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She sat across from him, nursing her coffee, watching him eat with the slow, measured pace of someone who'd learned not to waste food. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something ancient, something no 10-year-old should carry. "Can I ask you something, Davis?" She kept her voice soft. "How did your mother know my husband?" He set down his fork, his hands folding automatically in his lap. "She said Mr. James saved her life once. A long time ago, before I was born." His voice was barely above a whisper. "She said when she got sick, she wasn't scared because she knew Mr. James would keep his promise. That when she was gone, he'd save mine too." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything Elizabeth thought she knew. James had been charitable, yes. The Scott Foundation donated millions annually to hospitals, shelters, education programs. But those were public gestures, tax-deductible compassion with press releases and photo opportunities. This was something else entirely. Something personal. Something hidden. "Did she ever tell you how he saved her?" Davis shook his head. "Just that he found her when she thought nobody would. That he saw her when she was invisible." Elizabeth's hands trembled around her coffee cup. She'd been married to James for 15 years. She'd known his routines, his habits, his secrets, or so she thought. How had he hidden an entire promise, an entire person, from her life? That night, sleep refused to come. Elizabeth lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Davis's words echoing in her mind. Finally, at 2 a.m, she rose and made her way to James's study. The room remained exactly as he'd left it, leather-bound books lining the walls, his reading glasses still on the desk, the faint scent of his cologne clinging to the air like a ghost. She began methodically, searching through drawers, filing cabinets, the small safe where he kept important documents. Nothing. Just business contracts, investment portfolios, the mundane architecture of a billionaire's life. Then she saw it. Behind a row of family photographs on the bookshelf, something caught the light differently. She moved the silver frames aside and found a slim envelope wedged between 2 volumes of estate law. Her breath caught when she saw the handwriting, James's distinctive script, bold and certain. The envelope read, "To the boy I owe my redemption." Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a folded letter. The photo showed James, perhaps 15 years younger, standing in what looked like a hospital room. Beside him stood a young woman with kind eyes and an exhausted smile, cradling a newborn wrapped in blue. The woman was Maria Jackson. The baby was Davis. Elizabeth sank into James's leather chair, the photograph trembling in her hands. Her husband stared back at her from across the years, his expression tender and protective in a way she'd rarely seen. This wasn't charity. This was love. Not romantic love, but something deeper, something forged in circumstances she didn't understand. She unfolded the letter, her vision blurring with tears as she read the first line. Liz, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry for every secret I kept. Elizabeth didn't sleep the rest of the night. She sat in James's study, reading and rereading the letter until the words blurred together, each line raising more questions than answers. By dawn, she'd made a decision. At 7 o'clock sharp, she called Martha Lane. Martha had been the Scott family attorney for 20 years, a sharp-minded woman in her 60s who'd seen Elizabeth through corporate battles, hostile takeovers, and James's death. If anyone could find answers without judgment, it was Martha. I need you to find everything you can about a woman named Maria Jackson, Elizabeth said without preamble. Hospital janitor. Died recently, possibly at Mercy Hospital. And I need it done quietly. There was a pause on the other end. Elizabeth, what's this about? I'll explain when I know more. Please, Martha. It's important. By noon, Martha called back. Maria Elena Jackson. Age 32 at time of death. Worked as a janitor at Mercy Hospital for 8 years. Died 3 months ago from complications of pneumonia. She has one surviving child, a son named Davis, age 10. No father listed on the birth certificate. Next of kin, none. Martha's voice softened. Elizabeth, why are you looking into this woman? Because her son is sleeping in my guest room, Elizabeth said quietly. And because my husband made her a promise I never knew about. The silence on the line spoke volumes. An hour later, Elizabeth stood in the parking lot of Mercy Hospital, staring up at the gray concrete building where Maria Jackson had spent her final days. The same building where she'd spent years cleaning floors, emptying trash, invisible to most of the people who walked past her. The same building where James had apparently seen her. Inside, the antiseptic smell brought back memories of James's last weeks. Elizabeth had to steady herself against the reception desk before asking to speak with someone who'd known Maria Jackson. The nurse who responded was a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Patricia Monroe. Her eyes softened when Elizabeth mentioned Maria's name. Maria, Patricia said, shaking her head. God, that woman worked harder than anyone I've ever known. Double shifts most weeks, always volunteering to cover holidays so other people could be with their families. She was raising that boy alone, trying to give him everything. She paused. Are you family? No, Elizabeth said carefully. But I'm looking after her son now. I'm trying to understand how she died. And if there was anyone helping her at the end. Patricia's expression shifted, something like recognition crossing her face. You're Mrs. Scott, aren't you? James Scott's wife. Elizabeth's heart hammered. Yes. Did you know my husband? Not personally. But Maria talked about him sometimes. Said he was the kindest man she'd ever met. Patricia glanced around, then lowered her voice. Come with me. She led Elizabeth to a quiet corner near the hospital chapel. Your husband paid for Maria's treatment. All of it. The pneumonia turned into respiratory failure, she needed ICU care for weeks. The bills would have bankrupted her, not that she had anything to bankrupt. But every time the billing department called about payment, they said it was covered by a private charitable fund. Patricia met Elizabeth's eyes. The James Scott Memorial Fund. Set up months before your husband even died. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Elizabeth's feet. He set up a fund in his own name while he was still alive. Not publicly. It wasn't part of the Scott Foundation. This was separate, personal. I only know because I handled some of Maria's paperwork. Patricia's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Mrs. Scott, your husband visited Maria 3 times while she was dying. The last time, I was there. She could barely speak, but she grabbed his hand and said something I'll never forget. Elizabeth's mouth went dry. What did she say? She said, I kept my promise, James. Tell my boy, he'll find his father when he finds the truth. Patricia's eyes glistened. Your husband was crying. He told her, I'll keep mine too. Davis will never be alone. The word struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. She gripped the wall for support, her mind racing. He'll find his father when he finds the truth. What truth? What promise had Maria kept? And why had James hidden all of this from her? Did my husband? Elizabeth's voice cracked. Did he ever say anything else? Anything about his connection to Maria? Patricia shook her head slowly. Just that he owed her his life. That she saved him when he couldn't save himself. She touched Elizabeth's arm gently. Whatever their story was, Mrs. Scott, I can tell you this, there was nothing improper about it. The way your husband looked at Maria, it wasn't romantic. It was, grateful. Like she'd given him something he could never repay. Elizabeth nodded numbly, unable to speak. She thanked Patricia and walked back through the hospital corridors, past the janitorial closets where Maria had worked, past the ICU where she'd died, past all the places where her husband had lived a secret life of compassion Elizabeth had never witnessed. By the time she reached her car, tears were streaming down her face. Not from betrayal, but from something more complicated. James had kept secrets, yes. But those secrets were acts of love, promises kept in shadows because perhaps he'd thought Elizabeth wouldn't understand. Or perhaps because he'd been protecting something so personal, so painful, that sharing it would have meant reliving trauma he tried to bury. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph from the envelope again. James, Maria, and baby Davis. 3 people bound by a promise she still didn't fully understand. But she would. For Davis's sake and for her own, she would uncover every truth her husband had hidden. Even if those truths shattered everything she thought she knew about the man she'd loved. Elizabeth spent the next morning in the glass-walled conference room of the Scott Foundation headquarters, surrounded by financial records that dated back 15 years. Her assistant had pulled every file related to private charitable disbursements, and now they sat in neat stacks across the mahogany table like evidence at a trial. She worked methodically, tracing each donation, each grant, each emergency fund allocation. The Scott Foundation was her legacy as much as James's. She knew every program, every initiative, every dollar that flowed through their accounts. Or so she thought. It was nearly noon when she found the first discrepancy. A withdrawal of $50,000 from the Emergency Medical Assistance Fund, dated 7 years ago. The recipient line was blank. No name, no hospital, no case number. Just a transaction code and James's authorization signature. She pulled up the digital records. The file had been deleted from the system. Only the paper trail remained, and even that was incomplete. She found 3 more withdrawals over the following years, each one larger than the last. The final one, dated 4 months ago, was for $200,000, issued just weeks before Maria Jackson died. All of them authorized by James. All of them missing from the official records. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She dialed Martin Lowe, the Foundation's chief financial officer. Martin had worked with James since the beginning, a meticulous man who treated every dollar like a sacred trust. If anyone knew about these withdrawals, it would be him. Elizabeth, Martin answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and professional. To what do I owe the pleasure? I need you in the conference room. Now. 20 minutes later, Martin Lowe sat across from her, his pressed suit and silver cufflinks catching the afternoon light. He'd brought his tablet and a leather portfolio, the picture of corporate efficiency. But Elizabeth saw the tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed against the table. She slid the documents toward him. Explain these. Martin glanced down, and something flickered across his face. Recognition. And beneath it, concern. Where did you find these? In the archives. Paper files that somehow never made it into our digital system. Elizabeth leaned forward. For withdrawals totaling over $400,000, all from the emergency medical fund. All authorized by my husband. All missing recipients. Martin's jaw tightened. Mrs. Scott, James handled those personally. They were private matters. Private matters don't disappear from our records, Martin. This foundation has a board, auditors, federal compliance requirements. Where did this money go? I can't say. Can't or won't. Martin met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something that looked like fear. Elizabeth, please. Your husband had his reasons for keeping certain things quiet. Best not to dig into the past. Some promises aren't meant to be reopened. The words landed like a threat wrapped in concern. Elizabeth felt ice creep down her spine. Are you telling me to stop investigating? I'm telling you that your husband protected you from certain truths. Truths that might hurt you unnecessarily. Martin's voice dropped. He wouldn't want you dragging all of this into the light. My husband is dead, Elizabeth said coldly. And his secrets are putting a 10-year-old boy's life at risk. So unless you want to explain to the board why we have $400,000 in undocumented withdrawals, I suggest you start talking. Martin stood slowly, gathering his files. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. But this conversation is over. If you continue this investigation, you'll be doing it without my cooperation. He paused at the door. And I hope you're prepared for what you might find. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Elizabeth alone with her documents and a growing sense of dread. Martin Lowe had been James's trusted confidant, his right hand in building the foundation. If he was hiding something, it went deeper than missing files. It went to the heart of everything James had built. That evening, Elizabeth sat with Davis in the estate's library, a fire crackling in the hearth. The boy had been quiet all day, reading books from James's collection, careful not to touch anything that looked valuable. Davis, Elizabeth said gently, I've been learning more about how my husband helped your mother. It seems he was very generous with her. Davis looked up from his book, his eyes older than his years. It wasn't just kindness, ma'am. What do you mean? Mom told me once, near the end. His voice was barely audible. She said when Mr. James first promised to help her, he was crying. She said he told her she'd saved his life, and he didn't know how to repay that kind of debt. Davis's fingers tightened on the book. She said he looked like someone who'd been drowning and just learned how to breathe again. Elizabeth's chest constricted. She thought of the James she'd known, confident, controlled, always composed. She couldn't picture him crying, couldn't imagine him drowning. But Maria Jackson had seen a version of her husband that Elizabeth never had. Did she tell you why he was drowning? Davis shook his head. Just that he was very sad before he met her. And that she helped him find his way back. Elizabeth stared into the fire, her mind racing. James had hidden a part of himself from her, a dark chapter he'd never shared. And somehow, Maria Jackson had been the light that pulled him through it. Now Martin Lowe was protecting that secret with the same fierce loyalty James had. Which meant whatever truth lay buried in those missing files, it was worth hiding at any cost. Elizabeth stood, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper. She would find every deleted file, trace every missing dollar, uncover every shadow Martin Lowe was trying to keep hidden. Because Davis deserved to know the truth about the man who'd promised to save him. And Elizabeth deserved to know the truth about the husband she'd thought she'd known. Even if that truth destroyed everything. The fire had burned down to embers when Davis finally spoke again. Elizabeth had almost thought he'd fallen asleep in the oversized leather chair, his small form curled beneath one of James's old cashmere throws. But his eyes were open, fixed on the dancing flames with an intensity that made him seem far older than 10. "My mom didn't plan to be a hero," he said quietly. "She just couldn't walk past someone who was hurting." Elizabeth set down her wine glass, giving him her full attention. "Tell me about her, Davis." He was silent for a long moment, gathering words like precious stones. "She worked nights mostly. At the hospital, cleaning operating rooms after surgeries. She said it was hard work, but honest. That nobody looks down on you when you're the reason their hospital stays clean." His voice carried a practiced quality, as though he'd heard these words repeated so many times they'd become gospel. Elizabeth's heart ached. One night, she was walking home from her shift. It was winter, really cold. She passed by this homeless shelter on Garfield Avenue. Davis's fingers twisted in the blanket. She said there was a car parked outside, engine running, just sitting there in the dark. Most people would have walked past, but Mom, she had this thing where she noticed people who didn't want to be noticed. Elizabeth leaned forward. "She saw someone in the car." Davis nodded. "A man. Just sitting there, staring at nothing." She said his hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and even from outside she could tell he was crying. She knocked on the window. The image formed in Elizabeth's mind with painful clarity. Maria Jackson, exhausted from a night shift, stopping to check on a stranger. Not because she had to, but because she couldn't help herself. "What happened?" He rolled down the window. She said he looked surprised that anyone could even see him, like he'd turned invisible to the world. Davis's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She asked if he was okay. He said no. He said he didn't think he'd ever be okay again. Elizabeth's breath caught. She could hear James saying those words, could picture the desperation that must have driven him to that dark parking lot. Mom didn't know what to do, so she did what she always did. She gave him the dinner she'd packed for herself. A sandwich and an apple. Told him that tomorrow would come whether he was ready or not, so he might as well be fed when it did. Davis smiled faintly. She said he laughed at that. Just a little. But it was the first real sound he'd made. Did he tell her why he was there? Why he was? Elizabeth couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't ask. She said people in that much pain don't need questions, they need witnesses. Someone to sit with them until the darkness passes. Davis's eyes met hers. So she sat with him for 3 hours in that parking lot. Talking about everything and nothing. About her job, about me, I was just a baby then. About how hard life was, but how giving up didn't make it easier, just final. Elizabeth felt tears slip down her cheeks. This was the James she'd never known. The man who'd been so broken he'd contemplated ending everything. How had she missed it? How had she shared his bed, his life, his dreams, and never seen that darkness? When the sun came up, Davis continued, Mr. James told her his name. He said she'd saved his life, that he didn't know how to thank her. Mom said he didn't need to thank her, that kindness wasn't a debt. But he insisted. Davis's voice trembled. He said, if ever your boy is lost, tell him to find me. I'll make sure he's never alone. The promise hung in the air between them, sacred and terrible. Elizabeth understood now. This wasn't about guilt or obligation. It was about a man who'd been given a second chance at life and wanted to pass that gift forward. Your mother kept in touch with him? Not really. Mr. James found out where she worked and started donating to the hospital's charity fund. He'd send cards on my birthday with money inside. Mom always tried to send it back, but he was stubborn. A sad smile crossed Davis's face. She said rich people are good at being stubborn. That they think money fixes things. But he wanted to fix things, Elizabeth said softly. Yeah. But Mom didn't need fixing. She just needed help sometimes, like everybody does. Davis pulled the blanket tighter. When she got sick and knew she wasn't getting better, she wrote me a letter. Told me about that night, about Mr. James. Said if anything happened to her, I should find him at the cemetery. That even though he was gone, his promise wasn't. Elizabeth moved from her chair to kneel beside Davis, taking his small, cold hand in hers. Your mother was remarkable. And my husband, he kept his promise. Through me, he's still keeping it. You don't have to, Davis said quickly. I know I'm not your responsibility. You're not a responsibility, Elizabeth said firmly. You're a gift. A reminder that the best parts of people don't die with them. She squeezed his hand. Your mother saved my husband's life. The least I can do is honor her memory by making sure you're safe, loved, and cared for. For the first time since she'd found him at the grave, Davis's composure cracked. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he leaned forward, and Elizabeth pulled him into her arms. He was so small, so fragile, yet he'd carried the weight of survival alone for months. No more. As she held him, Elizabeth made a silent vow. She would uncover every secret, expose every lie, and dismantle every obstacle standing between this boy and the future he deserved. Martin Lowe's warnings be damned. The Foundation's reputation be damned. Davis Jackson was James's legacy, the truest, purest form of redemption her husband had ever achieved. And she would die before she let anyone take that away from him. Elizabeth spent the next 3 days becoming a woman she barely recognized. She hired a forensic accountant, a discreet investigator named Chen who specialized in nonprofit fraud. She pulled every backup server record from the Foundation's archives. She interviewed staff members who'd worked with James, asking careful questions about Martin Lowe's role in managing the private charitable funds. What she found made her blood run cold. The missing $400,000 was just the beginning. Chen's analysis revealed a pattern of embezzlement stretching back nearly 8 years, hidden within the labyrinth of the Foundation's humanitarian programs. Legitimate donations had been siphoned into ghost accounts. Grants to real organizations had been inflated, with the excess redirected through shell companies. The total losses exceeded $7 million. And at the center of it all was Martin Lowe. But the most damning discovery came when Chen recovered deleted files from an old backup server. Maria Jackson's complete medical file, meticulously documented by James himself, showing every payment, every authorization, every penny he'd spent saving her life. Martin had deleted it 2 months after James died, along with records of 6 other individuals James had personally helped. He was erasing evidence, Chen explained, spreading the recovered documents across Elizabeth's desk. Your husband kept detailed records of his private charity work. Lowe needed those records gone to hide the fact that he'd been embezzling from the same funds. Elizabeth's hands shook as she reviewed the files. James had helped Maria Jackson, yes, but he'd also helped a homeless veteran with cancer, a single father whose child needed surgery, an elderly woman facing eviction. 7 people whose lives James had saved in quiet, undocumented acts of compassion. And Martin Lowe had stolen from all of them. When Mr. Scott died, Chen continued, Lowe became interim CFO and then permanent CFO within 6 months. He had complete control over the Foundation's finances. Anyone who questioned the discrepancies was reassigned or let go. How did no one catch this? Because Lowe was careful. He never took enough to trigger audits. He spread the embezzlement across multiple programs, made it look like administrative overhead or program expansion. Chen's expression darkened. Your husband probably would have discovered it eventually. But he died before he could. Elizabeth felt sick. James had trusted Martin. They'd built the Foundation together, shared a vision of using wealth to transform lives. And all along, Martin had been bleeding it dry. She scheduled a meeting for the following morning. This time, she came prepared. Martin Lowe arrived at the Foundation's headquarters at 8 o'clock sharp, immaculate as always in his tailored suit. Elizabeth waited in the boardroom, Chen's report laid out before her like an indictment. Elizabeth, Martin said smoothly, taking a seat. I hope we can put our previous disagreement behind us. James wouldn't want us at odds. Don't you dare speak his name. Elizabeth's voice was ice. She slid the forensic report across the table. $7 million, Martin. Over 8 years. Ghost accounts, shell companies, deleted files. Did you think I wouldn't find it? The color drained from Martin's face. For a moment, his practiced composure slipped, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Then he recovered, his expression hardening into something ugly. You have no idea what you're doing, he said quietly. I'm exposing a thief who stole from a charity meant to help people who couldn't help themselves. I'm avenging my husband's trust. Martin leaned back, a cold smile forming. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're about to destroy everything James built. He gestured at the documents. You go public with this, and every news outlet in the country will run stories about the Scott Foundation's financial irregularities. They'll dig into every donation, every grant, every penny. And when they find out about Maria Jackson and her son. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Oh yes, I know about the boy, Martin continued. James's special project. A young woman he paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to over the years. A child conveniently appearing after his death, claiming to be the recipient of his promises. He leaned forward. If you expose this, people will think your husband had a secret child. That he was having an affair. That every private donation was a cover-up. His legacy will crumble, Elizabeth. Everything he worked for will be remembered as a lie. The threat hung in the air like poison. Elizabeth felt it trying to work its way into her resolve, seeds of doubt about whether protecting James's reputation mattered more than seeking justice. Then she thought of Davis, sleeping safely in her home. She thought of Maria Jackson, dying in a hospital bed, trusting that James's promise would outlive them both. She thought of the 6 other people Martin had erased, their stories deleted as though they'd never mattered. She stood slowly, gathering the documents. You know what I've learned, Martin. My husband's legacy isn't his reputation. It's not the foundation or the buildings that bear his name. It's the people he saved when no one was watching. The promises he kept in the dark. Elizabeth, be reasonable. I'm being perfectly reasonable. Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon to resign and return every dollar you stole. If you don't, I'll have these documents on every prosecutor's desk in the city by morning. Martin shot to his feet. You're making a mistake. I have friends on the board, connections you can't imagine. I'll bury you in litigation for years. Then let it crumble on truth, not on lies, Elizabeth said coldly. Because I'd rather see everything burn than let my husband's name be used to cover your crimes. She walked to the door, then paused. James saw the best in people. He gave you opportunities, trust, respect. And you repaid him by stealing from the very people he was trying to save. Her eyes burned into him. You're not worth one more second of his legacy. She left him standing in the boardroom, his face twisted with fury and fear. By noon, Martin Lowe's resignation letter arrived. By 3 o'clock, his attorney had contacted Chin about restitution. By evening, Elizabeth sat in her attorney's office, Martha Lane beside her, preparing criminal referrals and civil lawsuits. This is going to get ugly, Martha warned. Martin has powerful friends. The media attention will be intense. Let them come, Elizabeth said. I have something they don't. What's that? The truth. And a 10-year-old boy who deserves better than to live in the shadow of lies. Martha smiled faintly. James would be proud of you. Elizabeth looked out the window at the city lights spreading below. I hope so. Because I'm just getting started. The address Elizabeth found in James's files led them to a part of the city she'd never visited, a neighborhood where hope seemed to have packed its bags long ago. Cracked sidewalks. Boarded windows. Graffiti-scarred walls that told stories of survival, not dreams. Davis pressed his face against the car window, his breath fogging the glass. "I used to sleep here sometimes," he said quietly. "When the shelters downtown were full." Elizabeth's chest tightened. She'd lived in a mansion with 12 bedrooms while this child had wandered these streets searching for a safe place to lay his head. They parked outside a low brick building that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The windows were dirty, some cracked. The roof sagged in places. But there, beside the weathered front door, was a bronze plaque dulled by years of neglect. "Built by James Scott, for those who saved me." Elizabeth's hand trembled as she traced the engraved letters. James had never mentioned building anything here. This wasn't in any foundation records, any public statements, any board meeting minutes. This was something he'd done in silence. "Mrs. Scott." She turned to find an elderly black woman approaching, leaning heavily on a cane. Her eyes were kind but weary, carved by decades of witnessing struggle. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Elizabeth asked gently. "No, ma'am. But I know who you are. Saw you on the news once with Mr. James." The woman's gaze softened as it fell on Davis. "And I know this boy. Your mama was Maria, wasn't she, child?" Davis nodded, stepping closer to Elizabeth instinctively. "Thought so. You got her eyes." The woman looked back at the building. "Your husband built this place 15 years ago. Came here himself, spent time talking to folks, asking what we needed. Most rich people just throw money and leave. Not Mr. James. He stayed." "Why here?" Elizabeth's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Because of Maria." The woman pointed to a bench near the entrance. "She found him sitting right there one night, crying in his car. Said later he'd been thinking about ending it all, business troubles, depression, feeling like nothing mattered anymore." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "Maria brought him soup from her own kitchen. Sat with him for hours. Told him God don't make mistakes, and if he was still breathing, his story wasn't finished yet." Elizabeth felt tears burning behind her eyes. James had never told her about that night, about how close she'd come to losing him before they'd even built their life together. "He came back the next week," the woman continued, "asking for Maria. Wanted to thank her. Found out she was working 3 jobs, barely keeping food on the table for her boy. That's when he promised, he'd make sure her son would never sleep on cold streets. And he kept that promise, Mrs. Scott. Built this shelter, put Maria's name on scholarships, paid her medical bills when she got sick." The woman's voice cracked. "Your husband saved a lot of people. But Maria saved him first." Davis moved to the bench where his mother had once sat with a broken billionaire and offered him hope. He ran his small hand across the worn wood, and Elizabeth saw him fighting tears. "She never told me about that night," Davis whispered. "Just said Mr. James was a good man who understood what it meant to be lost." That evening, while Davis slept, Elizabeth returned to James's study with renewed purpose. Hidden in a leather portfolio she'd overlooked before, she found it, a DNA test report dated 6 months before James's death. The results were conclusive. Davis Jackson was not James Scott's biological son. But beneath the report was a letter in her husband's handwriting, sealed in an envelope addressed to her. "My dearest Elizabeth. If you're reading this, you found the truth I could never speak aloud. Davis is not my blood. But he carries the heart that saved mine. 15 years ago, I sat in a car outside a shelter, ready to end my life. A woman named Maria Jackson gave me soup and reminded me that mercy exists in the smallest gestures. She asked nothing in return. She simply saw a human being in pain and responded with grace. I couldn't save Maria, cancer took her before I could repay even a fraction of her kindness. But I can save her son. Not because biology demands it, but because love does. This boy is my promise kept. My redemption in human form. If I'm gone and he finds you, please see what I saw, not charity, but family. Not obligation, but honor. Legacy isn't what you leave in banks. It's what you leave in people. Always yours, James. Elizabeth pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming freely now. Her husband hadn't hidden a scandal. He'd hidden a salvation, his own and the boys'. And now that salvation had been placed in her hands. The Scott Foundation's main conference hall hadn't seen this many reporters since James's funeral. Cameras lined the back wall. Journalists filled every seat, their phones poised to capture whatever bombshell Elizabeth Scott was about to drop. Rumors had been swirling for days: embezzlement, financial scandal, secrets buried in charitable funds. Elizabeth stood backstage, Martha Lane beside her, watching the crowd through a gap in the curtain. Her hands were steady, but her heart thundered against her ribs. "You don't have to do this," Martha said quietly. "We could handle the legal proceedings privately. Martin's already cooperating with prosecutors." "No." Elizabeth's voice was firm. "James lived his greatest act of kindness in silence. I won't let it die there." She thought of Davis, sitting in the front row beside Chen, the forensic accountant who'd helped uncover the truth. The boy wore a new suit, his first, but still fidgeted with nervous energy. When their eyes met, Elizabeth smiled, and some of the tension left his small shoulders. "It's time," Martha said. Elizabeth walked onto the stage to an explosion of camera flashes. She stood behind the podium bearing the foundation's logo, a logo that would be different by the end of this conference, and waited for the chaos to settle into expectant silence. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding boardrooms. "I've called this conference to address recent allegations regarding financial irregularities at the Scott Foundation, and to reveal a truth that my late husband carried until his last breath." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that Martin Lowe, our former CFO, embezzled over $7 million from foundation funds over an 8-year period. He systematically stole from programs designed to help our city's most vulnerable citizens. He deleted records, falsified reports, and silenced anyone who questioned discrepancies. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. "Mr. Lowe has resigned and is currently cooperating with federal prosecutors. Every stolen dollar will be recovered and returned to its rightful purpose." Elizabeth's gaze hardened. "But that's not why I'm here today." She reached into her jacket and withdrew James's letter, the one she'd found with the DNA test. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. "My husband, James Scott, was a man of profound private generosity. While building this foundation's public programs, he also maintained a secret charitable fund for individuals who touched his life personally." Her voice softened. "One of those individuals was a woman named Maria Jackson." Elizabeth told the story then, all of it. The night James sat broken in his car, ready to give up. Maria's simple act of bringing soup to a stranger. The promise James made to protect her son. The shelter built in silence. The medical bills paid without fanfare. The DNA test proving no biological connection, and the letter explaining why biology didn't matter. When she read James's words aloud, "Legacy is not what you leave in banks, but what you leave in people," her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "Maria Jackson died 8 months ago, leaving behind a 10-year-old son named Davis." Elizabeth gestured to the boy in the front row. Cameras swiveled toward him, but she raised her hand. "Before you speculate, before you create scandalous headlines, understand this: Davis is not my husband's biological child. James helped him because 15 years ago, his mother saved my husband's life with nothing more than kindness and soup." The room had gone utterly silent. "Today, I'm announcing the full restoration and restructuring of the Scott Foundation. It will be renamed the Promise House, dedicated to honoring not just my husband's memory, but Maria Jackson's legacy of seeing humanity in strangers." Elizabeth's eyes blazed. "We will help forgotten children, struggling families, and anyone who falls through society's cracks. Not because charity demands it, but because compassion does. She folded the letter carefully. My husband kept his greatest act of grace hidden, perhaps because he thought the world wouldn't understand. But I believe the world needs to understand that true legacy isn't measured in wealth or buildings. It's measured in promises kept, in lives saved, in small mercies that ripple forward long after we're gone. As Elizabeth left the podium, the room erupted, not with scandal-hungry questions, but with something that sounded almost like reverence. That evening, news outlets across the country ran the story. Not as a scandal, but as something rare, a story of redemption, of hidden kindness revealed, of a widow who transformed her husband's quiet grace into a beacon. And in a city precinct downtown, Martin Lowe was arrested, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about betraying trust. But in Elizabeth's home, Davis Jackson fell asleep knowing his mother's kindness had saved more than one life, it had saved a man's soul and, through him, countless others still to come. The cemetery looked different now. Spring had arrived quietly, transforming the gray landscape Elizabeth had known into something softer. Green shoots pushed through thawing earth. Early crocuses dotted the grass in clusters of purple and white. Even the sky seemed gentler, clouds drifting lazily across pale blue instead of pressing down like a weight. Elizabeth walked slowly beside Davis, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He'd grown in the 3 months since that first cold morning, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself. The haunted look had faded from his eyes, replaced by something steadier. Something that looked almost like peace. They stopped before James's headstone. Someone, probably the groundskeeper, had cleaned it recently. The engraved letters stood out sharp and clear. James Michael Scott. Beloved husband. When someone you love becomes a memory, the memory becomes a treasure. Davis knelt, pulling a single white lily from inside his jacket. His small hands were gentle as he placed it beside the roses Elizabeth had brought. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the name carved in stone. Then, so softly Elizabeth almost didn't hear it, he whispered. Thank you for keeping your promise. Elizabeth's vision blurred. She blinked hard, but the tears came anyway, sliding down her cheeks in hot tracks. She knelt beside Davis, her knees pressing into the damp grass, and reached out to touch the engraved letters of her husband's name. The stone was cold beneath her fingertips, but she imagined she could feel warmth there, an echo of the man who'd lived with such quiet grace, who'd carried his greatest act of love like a secret too precious to speak aloud. He did more than keep it, Davis, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw not charity, not obligation, not even her husband's legacy. She saw family. He sent you to keep mine. Davis turned to her, confusion flickering in his eyes. What promise? Elizabeth smiled through her tears, reaching out to cup his face gently. The promise I made to James on our wedding day. To love beyond reason. To see people, not just their circumstances. To build a life that matters. Her thumb brushed away a tear on the boy's cheek, she hadn't realized he was crying too. I'd forgotten how to do that after he died. I'd forgotten how to be anything but alone. You're not alone anymore, Davis said simply, with the profound wisdom of children who'd learned too young what loneliness truly meant. No, Elizabeth agreed, pulling him into a hug. Neither of us is. They stayed like that for a while, two people grieving different losses but finding the same comfort, the knowledge that love doesn't end at a gravestone, that promises can outlive those who make them, that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. When they finally stood, Elizabeth's legs were stiff from kneeling, but her heart felt lighter than it had in 2 years. She took Davis's hand, not the careful, tentative touch of those early days, but the firm, warm grasp of family. As they walked back toward the car, something miraculous happened. The clouds that had been threatening rain all morning suddenly parted. Sunlight spilled through the gap like liquid gold, washing across the cemetery in waves of warmth and light. Davis looked up, squinting against the brightness, and smiled. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "Ready to go home?" "Yeah," he said, squeezing back. "I'm ready." They walked away together, leaving behind only flowers and memories, carrying forward something far more precious, a promise kept, a life redeemed, and a future built not on what they'd lost, but on what they'd found. Sometimes, the people we think we're saving are the ones sent to save us. Maria Jackson gave soup to a stranger and saved a billionaire's life. James Scott made a promise and saved a child's future. And Elizabeth Scott opened her heart and saved them both from being forgotten. Sometimes, promises don't end in death, they begin there. Because legacy isn't what you leave in banks or buildings. It's what you leave in people. It's the kindness that echoes forward long after you're gone. It's the small mercies that grow into great loves. And sometimes, the most profound truth is also the simplest: we are all just people, trying to find our way home. And home isn't always a place. Sometimes, it's a promise kept. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If this story touched your heart, then remember, truth always finds its way, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. People like Martin Lowe thought they could hide lies behind money and power, but kindness always exposes what greed tries to cover. Hit subscribe if you believe honesty should never be silenced, not by fear, not by wealth, not by anyone. Don't be like Martin, protecting lies to save a reputation. Be like Elizabeth, brave enough to face the truth even when it hurts. And if you believe every child deserves a fair chance, no matter where they come from. Comment, I believe in second chances. Because in the end, compassion is the only legacy worth leaving behind.